Okay, so we've seen that we can make typological predictions about what kinds of languages do and don't exist using OT, but only with a specific constraint set, with some specific contents in those constraints. And this kind of raises the question, well, where are we getting the constraints from? Right? So far, I've just been kind of saying, we're going to use this constraint and not use this other constraint, and here, work with these constraints. And the question is, well, where do those come from? How do we know which constraints do and don't exist in the world's languages? And this is, in some sense, the central question in all of constraint-based phonology, right? So if we're doing optimality theory, then any question we have about phonological systems is, in some sense, a question about what's in the constraint set. And in this framework, doing phonology is basically the process of trying to figure out the nature of the constraint set. So in order to do this, there are no hard and fast rules about figuring out constraints. If there were, then we'd be done with our jobs and I'd have nothing to teach you. But there are a bunch of useful approaches, and I wanted to go over two broad kinds of approaches to this problem in this lecture. So the one that we've been using here, at least implicitly, is the inductive approach or inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning more generally refers to using specific principles to try to infer more general ones. So using specific data points to try to learn something more generally. And with respect to phonology, this is going to involve basically looking at a bunch of languages. That's what we did with the anteriority contrasts, and noting some commonalities and some differences. So several languages, for instance, seem to disprefer C or to prefer she, depending on how you want to phrase that. And some languages, like Spanish, seem to generally disfavor esh. So how could we write those preferences up as constraints? What are some constraints that would account for those observed properties? So we're going from very specific facts about particular languages and what kinds of segments or features they allow in different contexts, to more general principles, which are universal markedness constraints that we think are potentially active in any language, right? So going from the specific to the general is inductive reasoning, and this is certainly a very big part of how phonology works. We look at patterns in specific languages and ask how we might infer some general properties of phonology from looking at those specific languages. But there's another possibility, and again, this is not just about phonology or about linguistics, but the general process of trying to figure out or derive specific facts from general principles, that is, working sort of downwards. This is referred to as deductive reasoning. And this is also an important aspect of phonological thought, right? So most phonologists agree that whatever constraints or rules we have in the phonology are in some sense grounded in phonetic facts, right? So they might not be fully predictable from the phonetics, but in general, there are principles of articulation, principles of aerodynamics, principles of speech perception that might have some effect on what phonological systems, on what language-specific grammars look like. So another way to do this would be to start with phonetic facts, general principles of how speech works, and ask whether they have some consequences for the constraint set or for the typological patterns themselves, right? So for specific languages, this is starting from the general and inferring things about specific cases based on general principles. And these are both important. Here's an example of a deductive approach to what we've just been doing in this class, namely looking at anteriority contrasts for fricatives. And on the left here, you can see an anterior fricative. These are all just illustrations. They're not real data, but they're based on I think mostly X-ray data from people's actual vocal tracts. So you can see here, this sort of blob in the middle is the tongue. And for an anterior fricative, like S or Z, you can see that the tongue tip is sort of up here near the top teeth. There's a very tight constriction at the alveolar ridge. It's not probably quite blocking airflow, but it's making it flow through a very narrow cavity, probably hitting these top teeth and making lots of strident noise. And the difference between that anterior fricative and a non-anterior one, like sh or zh, here the tongue tip's going to be down a little bit further near the lower teeth, and there's this dome shape to the tongue blade, the area behind the tongue tip, that's creating also a narrow constriction, but it's one that extends further back, not just along the teeth and the alveolar ridge, but also along the palate. So getting into this post-alveolar region, approaching the hard palate here. And so this is going to be the main difference between anterior and non-anterior fricatives, is the sort of location and shape of the tongue blade and tip. And here's an X-ray tracing of a front vowel like E or A. And you can see as well that, there's a wider constriction in here. Oops, didn't mean to do that. It's not quite as narrow as the fricatives, but you can also see some basic commonalities between what the tongue is doing here, and this is the tongue in this picture, and these sounds over here. So the first question, which one of these consonant tongue shapes looks more like the front vowel tongue shape as for a vowel like E? And I think the clear answer here is that the non-anterior fricatives are already much closer to an E-like vowel than the anterior ones are. Right? So these are much more similar tongue shapes than either one is to this one, the anterior one. And this is sort of unsurprising. You'll sometimes see the vowel E in particular described as being almost like a palatal consonant, because it's clear that the tongue blade approximates the hard palate here, and that's where the high front nature of that vowel comes from. That's not so different than post-alveolar or alveopalatal esh. So you would expect there to be some sort of an articulatory similarity or dependency between a pseudo-palatal consonant and a pseudo-palatal vowel that it doesn't share with a more anterior consonant. We talked about co-articulation already in this class, and this refers to the idea that sounds are really not pronounced neatly as separate discrete elements like IPA symbols. Instead, in real life, when you're actually speaking, the vocal tract is continually moving and shifting from one configuration to another. So if you have a non-anterior fricative followed by an E-like vowel, then there's going to be not so much movement. They're going to have relatively similar tongue configurations. However, if you're moving from an anterior fricative to a high front vowel, as in a C sequence, this is going to need to involve some changing and reconfiguring of the tongue blade and the tongue tip as you're moving from this sound to this sound. And if you sort of start to anticipate this tongue shape while you're in the middle of producing a S-like sound, here's a question. What do you think that might sound like? Well, if the tongue starts moving towards this shape before it's actually the glottis has started producing voicing and the vocal tract is opened, what you're going to get is a shift through an intermediate area that looks a lot like a non-anterior fricative. Right, so among other things, one thing we could say here is that, first of all, it's going to be easier to have a fricative and a vowel that roughly match each other in tongue shape than one that mismatches. But second of all, if you're really sort of producing these at the same time and anticipating this vowel gesture while you're in the middle of the fricative gesture, it's entirely possible that these fricatives are going to end up sounding more like non-anterior ones anyway. So it's possible that over generations, maybe you're actually going to mislearn consonants like this as being actually consonants like this when they occur before a tongue shape or a vowel that's like this. So there's a number of possible ways to think about why you might prefer sh-e sequences over s-e ones, and they mostly have to do with phonetics. Right? So just by looking at these articulatory records, you might be able to infer just from looking at these that this kind of a consonant would be more consistent with this vowel than this kind of a consonant is. And that's, in a sense, sort of deriving the specific constraint star plus anterior plus continuant minus sonorant don't have a anterior fricative before minus back plus high minus round, before a high front unrounded vowel. And actually, probably the rounding doesn't make any difference at all. I've just put that feature in there because that's what we've been looking at. But it's really about high front vowels and anterior versus non-anterior sounds, right? So that's one way in which we might take some cues or some clues from the phonetics and ask about the consequences for phonology. Another example, which I'll go through in detail in the next section, involves laryngeal features and voice onset time. So this is coming back to some material we covered earlier in this class, and we're going to take a little bit more of a detailed look at this now.